Imagine sitting at home on a quiet evening, when suddenly there's a pounding at your door. You open it and two police officers are standing there, staring you down, accusing you of illegal activity. Your heart races, you know you've done nothing wrong, but then, in the middle of all that tension, your wife steps out from behind you in full police uniform. And in that instant, everything changes. Living in a neighborhood with an HOA always sounds nice on paper. The brochures and sales pitches make it feel like you're moving into a place where everything is neat, tidy, and organized. They promise that the HOA will keep the lawns green, the houses painted, and the neighborhood peaceful. At first glance, it feels like the perfect system to protect your investment and maintain property value. But once you actually start living there, you quickly realize that the HOA doesn't just stop at making sure things look nice, they start creeping into every single corner of your personal life. It begins with little notes slipped into your mailbox or stuck to your front door. Maybe your trash can was visible from the street for a few extra hours after collection day, or maybe a small patch of your grass turned brown in the summer heat. Instead of a friendly reminder, you get a formal warning letter written like you committed a crime. At first, you laugh it off. It's annoying, but you figure it's not worth making a big deal out of. After all, the rules are there for everyone, right? But soon enough, you notice that the letters keep coming. The worst part is how nitpicky they can get. You might have parked your car in the driveway for 2 nights in a row instead of pulling it into the garage, and suddenly it's a violation of community standards. If you paint your front door a shade too dark or too bright without their written approval, they'll fine you. Even something as harmless as leaving holiday decorations up for a few days past the deadline can get you in trouble. And the more you deal with it, the more you realize that HOAs thrive on control. They aren't just protecting the neighborhood, they're policing it, like they're waiting for you to slip up so they can swoop in and remind you who's in charge. The strangest part is how inconsistent they can be. You'll see one neighbor with weeds in their flower bed that somehow never gets cited, while you get a letter because your lawn was mowed a day later than usual. It feels like they pick and choose who to target, and once they've got their eyes on you, it doesn't matter what you do, they'll always find something to complain about. For me, living under this HOA had already been frustrating. I knew they didn't like me much, and I had a feeling they were keeping closer tabs on me than on anyone else. Still, I never imagined their pettiness would go so far that they'd actually escalate things beyond warning letters and fines. At that point, I thought I'd just have to put up with their nonsense. I had no idea that soon, their complaints would get so extreme that they'd end up sending the police to my front door. It was a normal evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I was at home, unwinding after a long day, when suddenly there was a loud, sharp knock at the door. Not the casual kind of knock a neighbor gives when they want to borrow some sugar or say hello. This was heavy, deliberate, and forceful, the kind of knock that instantly makes your heart beat faster. You know right away when a knock means business, and this one practically demanded that I answer immediately. For a split second, I wondered if it was a delivery gone wrong or maybe some kind of emergency in the neighborhood. But deep down, a strange unease crept in. I opened the door, and my stomach dropped. Standing there were 2 uniformed police officers, serious expressions painted on their faces. They weren't smiling, they weren't relaxed, they looked as if they were responding to a major situation. One officer stood slightly in front, shoulders squared, eyes locked on me, while the other kept glancing around, scanning the property as though he expected to catch something out of place. The air around them felt heavy, like tension had walked right up to my doorstep. "Sir," the first officer began in a firm voice, "we've received a complaint about illegal activity at this residence." Those words hit me like a punch to the chest. Illegal activity? Here? My brain scrambled for an explanation. I'd never had so much as a noise complaint before, let alone anything remotely criminal. My mind raced. Did they have the wrong house? Was this some bizarre mistake? The seriousness in their tone made me realize this wasn't some casual check-in. They weren't here just to chat or give me a warning, they were here because someone, somewhere, had made them believe something serious was happening in my home. Trying to stay calm, I asked them to clarify. But instead of explaining right away, they started confirming my name, my address, and other details. The way they did it, slow, methodical, almost like an interrogation, made the pit in my stomach grow deeper. It was as if they were already convinced I might be hiding something. The more they spoke, the more it sank in. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a full-on accusation. I stood frozen in the doorway, a storm of confusion and frustration building inside me. I couldn't believe it had come to this. Sure, the HOA had been a headache with their endless nitpicking, but calling the police? That felt unreal, like they had crossed an invisible line I never thought they would. In that moment, all I could do was stand there under the weight of the officer's gaze, wondering how on earth things had spiraled so far out of control and what was about to happen next. When the words finally came out of the officer's mouth, they didn't just sound like a simple complaint, they sounded like an outright charge. We've had a report that there may be illegal activity taking place at this address. For a moment, I thought I misheard him. Illegal activity? At my house? I felt my chest tighten, as if I'd just been accused of something I couldn't even define. The way the officers stood there made it feel so real. They weren't casual or uncertain, they spoke as if they'd been briefed on a potentially serious situation. One officer kept his eyes locked on me while the other scanned past my shoulder into the house, as though expecting to see evidence of some crime right there in the living room. It made me feel exposed in my own home. I wanted to laugh and tell them they had the wrong address, but their expressions made it clear they weren't joking. What exactly are you talking about? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Illegal activity? Like what? They didn't answer directly. Instead, they repeated that they had received a call and that the call came from the neighborhood's HOA. Apparently, someone or maybe more than one person had reported suspicious behavior and claimed it was serious enough to involve law enforcement. Hearing that almost made me angrier than it made me afraid. Suspicious behavior? This was the HOA's favorite weapon, a vague phrase they could use for anything. Were they upset that my garbage cans were still by the curb? That my garage door had been open too long? Or had someone just decided they didn't like me and thought this would be a fun way to cause trouble? Still, it wasn't funny in the moment. Standing there, being questioned at my own front door by two officers who looked like they were prepared for the worst, I felt my palms go clammy. The way they confirmed my address again and asked if I lived there, you would think I was some kind of intruder in my own home. Every word they spoke made it seem more official, more dangerous. Inside my head, 100 questions raced. What if they didn't believe me? What if they insisted on searching the house? What if this escalated into something bigger, all because of a false complaint? I felt the weight of being misunderstood, of being treated like a suspect without even knowing what I was being accused of. It was a surreal, almost humiliating moment, me standing there defending myself against a crime I hadn't even been told about in detail. And in that tense silence between questions, one thought burned in my mind: the HOA has finally gone too far. The moment the officers began pressing further, the tension thickened in the air. They weren't just casually asking questions anymore, they were digging, methodical, like detectives trying to confirm a lead. One officer pulled out a small notepad, flipping it open with practiced precision, while the other kept shifting his weight, eyes darting from me to the windows of the house, then back to me again. It was the kind of body language that told me they weren't entirely convinced this was just a harmless stop. "Can you confirm your full name for me, sir?" the first officer asked. I gave it, my voice steady on the surface but my pulse thundering in my ears. He scribbled it down, cross-referenced something in his notes, and nodded to his partner. Then came the address. They asked for it, though they were already standing at the exact spot, the numbers clearly posted above the door. I repeated it anyway, my gut tightening with each confirmation. Somehow, answering simple facts about my own life felt like I was defending myself on trial. The questions grew more specific. How long have you lived here? Is anyone else inside the home? Have you had any recent disputes in the neighborhood? Each one carried a subtle weight, as if they were fishing for inconsistencies, waiting for me to trip over my words. It didn't help that the officer with the notepad barely blinked while writing, his face expressionless. The silence between his pen strokes felt louder than the questions themselves. I tried to stay calm, but the longer it went on, the more uncomfortable I became. I wasn't guilty of anything, yet the way they looked at me made me feel like I had something to hide. That's the worst part about being under suspicion. You start second-guessing yourself, worrying that even your honesty might look like a lie if you don't say it the right way. As they continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA had painted me as some sort of menace to the neighborhood. Maybe they exaggerated, maybe they outright lied, but whatever they told the police was strong enough to bring them to my door in the middle of the evening. And now here I was, being scrutinized as if my quiet life was a front for something darker. My throat felt dry. Every answer I gave seemed to lead to another question, and it felt endless, like being trapped under a spotlight. They weren't raising their voices, but their steady tone carried an authority that pressed down on me. It was a suffocating mix of fear and frustration. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but in moments like this, innocence doesn't feel like much protection. Just when the weight of it all was about to boil over, when I wondered how much longer they'd keep standing there digging into my life, the front door behind me creaked open, and everything about the situation shifted in an instant. The tension had built to its peak when I suddenly heard the sound of the front door opening wider behind me. At first, I thought maybe one of the kids had come out or that I'd left the door ajar, but then I caught the familiar sound of heavy-duty boots on the hardwood floor. In that instant, I already knew who it was, and for the first time since this whole thing started, a strange sense of relief washed over me. My wife stepped forward, calm and collected, her presence commanding before she even spoke a word. She had just come home from her shift and hadn't yet changed out of her uniform. There she stood, in full police gear, badge glinting under the porch light, her hair still pulled back tight from a long day of duty. To me, it was a sight I was used to, but to the two officers at the door, it was a complete game changer. The moment they saw her, their entire demeanor shifted. The officer with the notepad froze mid-scribble, his pen dangling in the air like he'd forgotten what he was doing. His partner, who had been scanning the property so intensely, suddenly stopped, his eyes locking onto her uniform like it was a beacon. Their expressions softened, but more than that, they straightened up, unconsciously adjusting their posture as if they were suddenly in the presence of someone outranking them. "What seems to be the problem, officers?" my wife asked, her tone calm but edged with authority. She didn't raise her voice, but the confidence in her delivery was enough to change the entire energy of the situation. It was surreal watching the shift happen. A moment ago, I had been under suspicion, every word I spoke carefully measured as if I might slip up and confirm their worst assumptions. Now, standing behind my wife, I watched the same men who had been grilling me only seconds earlier stumble over their explanation. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were speaking to her, carefully, respectfully, as if the hierarchy had suddenly been flipped upside down. They exchanged a quick glance, and then the officer with the notepad cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we received a call from the HOA about suspicious activity here. We were just following up." You could practically hear the change in tone, hesitant, almost apologetic. Their voices lacked the edge they'd used with me, replaced instead with cautious politeness. It was as if my wife's uniform had stripped away every ounce of confidence they'd walked up with. In that moment, it was crystal clear, the HOA might have thought they were sending backup to intimidate us, but instead, they'd ended up putting two officers face to face with one of their own. And by the looks on their faces, they weren't prepared for that twist. The silence that followed was almost comical. A minute ago, these two officers had walked up to my door with firm expressions, acting like they were ready to uncover some major crime. But the second they realized who my wife was, all that authority seemed to drain right out of them. Their shoulders, once squared and tense, loosened. Their pens, once poised to record my every word, hung uselessly at their sides. You could see it on their faces, the realization that this suspicious activity was nothing more than a waste of their time. My wife didn't let them off easy, though. She folded her arms across her chest and gave them that calm, level stare I've seen her use 100 times before when dealing with rookies on the job. "So," she said, her voice steady, "you came here because the HOA claimed something illegal was happening at my house?" Both officers shifted awkwardly, almost like schoolboys caught doing something they shouldn't. One cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am. That's what the dispatch report said. But, clearly, there's nothing wrong here. Looks like it was a false alarm." "False alarm," she repeated, her tone laced with quiet authority. "Or a false complaint." That landed hard. Neither officer could argue, and they didn't even try. Instead, they nodded in unison, the kind of nod people give when they know they're in the presence of someone who sees straight through the nonsense. Their whole demeanor screamed damage control. They spoke carefully, politely, every word measured as if they were trying to undo the tension they had caused by showing up. From where I stood, it was almost satisfying to watch. These men, who just minutes ago had been scrutinizing me like I was hiding something sinister, were now practically apologizing with their eyes. My wife hadn't raised her voice, hadn't flexed her authority, but the uniform alone carried weight they couldn't ignore. It forced them to confront the truth of the situation. That they had been used as pawns in some petty neighborhood power play. Finally, one of the officers gave a small, sheepish shrug. "Sorry for disturbing you, ma'am. We'll make a note in the system. You won't have any more issues from us on this." They both took a step back, visibly relieved to be leaving, their earlier bravado replaced with unease. Watching them retreat, I could almost see the thought written across their faces: we just got played by an HOA call, and we walked right into the home of a fellow officer. For me, it was the first time all evening I felt the tension start to dissolve. The fear and frustration I'd been carrying gave way to a strange sort of satisfaction. The HOA had tried to paint me as a criminal, but in the end, the cops walked away knowing exactly who the real problem was. As the officers gave their final apologies and turned to leave, the air on my doorstep finally felt lighter. I could almost feel the tension that had been pressing down on me just a few minutes earlier lift off my shoulders. Watching them retreat to their cruiser, heads slightly lowered, was like seeing the end of a storm. The pounding in my chest began to settle, but in its place came a different feeling, relief mixed with amusement. My wife stood there for a moment, arms still folded, eyes following them as they walked down the path. She didn't say a word until their car pulled away from the curb. Then she let out a small, controlled sigh and glanced at me with the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Suspicious activity, huh?" she said, her tone dry. "Guess mowing the lawn too late at night is a felony now." I couldn't help but laugh, the tension inside me breaking like glass. "You know," I told her, "sometimes I think that uniform of yours is better than a security system. Forget cameras and alarms, just you showing up shuts everything down." She chuckled softly, but her eyes still carried a trace of annoyance. "The real problem isn't the officers. They were just doing their job. The problem is that your HOA thinks it can play games with people's lives. Calling in bogus reports just to flex their power? That's not just petty, it's dangerous." And she was right. That thought stayed with me long after the officers were gone. The HOA wanted to intimidate me, to make me feel like I was always under their thumb, but instead they'd exposed themselves for what they really were: petty bullies with too much time on their hands. And thanks to my wife stepping out in uniform, that little plan of theirs had backfired spectacularly. From that night forward, something shifted. The HOA didn't stop sending out their silly notices entirely, but the tone was different. They were quieter, less aggressive, as though they finally realized I wasn't going to be easy prey. Maybe word had spread about what happened, or maybe they just didn't want to risk another embarrassing scene, but either way, I could tell they had been put in their place. For me, the whole ordeal became a story I'd never forget, a reminder of how quickly things can escalate when small-minded people are given too much authority, and how sometimes the perfect twist of fate can turn the tables in the most satisfying way. That night, I wasn't just grateful for my wife as my partner. I was grateful for her uniform, her presence, and the fact that when the HOA tried to bring me down, she was there to turn their own power play into their biggest embarrassment.